the horrors that occurred in the Nazi concentration camps, the society became aware that trusted doctors were able to commit the most horrifying crimes by committing human experiments on detained prisoners. This was a grave violation of their medical oath. We are all familiar with the words, "never again." It was in 2006 when the Epoch Times first reported about an allegation that at that time seemed too hideous and beyond our imagination that people could believe it. I'm talking about forced organ harvesting from living Falun Gong practitioners detained for their belief in Chinese detention camps. Over the past 16 years, many independent investigators have worked on this topic to shine light on what is now described as crimes against humanity. Hello, my name is Thorsten Trey. I'm the Executive Director of Doctors Against Forced Organ Harvesting, a non-profit medical organization that has organized this event. I will be your host at today's roundtable discussion. Please allow me to briefly introduce our guest speakers in alphabetical order. We have Dr. David Bader, Chair and Professor of the Department of Bioethics and Medical Humanism, and Professor of Pediatrics at the University of Arizona College of Medicine in Phoenix. Next, we have Dr. Alejandro Centurion, neurologist and member of DAFO's Board of Directors. Next, we have Dr. Weldon Gilcrease, Assistant Professor of Medicine at the University of Utah and Deputy Director of DAFO. Next, we have Dr. Martin Elliott, Professor Emeritus of Pediatric Cardiothoracic Surgery at the University College London, a member of the China Tribunal. And last but not least, Dr. Jacob Levy, Professor Emeritus of Surgery and Heart Transplantation at the Tel Aviv University and member of several advisory boards. Unfortunately, we received a last-minute note that Dr. Kaplan will not be able to join us today. A warm welcome to all of you. It is a great pleasure to see all of you at this roundtable, and I'm looking forward to our conversation. Before we start, please allow me to welcome our audience that is watching us on the live stream via the NTD and Epoch TV. Thank you all for joining us today. I would like to let you know that you can participate in our discussion today by sending questions to our panelists to our email address, questions@dafo.org. I will now open our roundtable discussion with our first question. And I will address a question to two or three of our panelists at a time so that we have a little conversation on the particular topic. For many years, commercial organ trafficking has violated ethical standards in the transplant field. When news broke in 2006 that Falun Gong practitioners in China were being killed on a large scale for the organs, many people reacted with disbelief. In order to distinguish this atrocity from commercial organ trafficking, DAFO created the name forced organ harvesting. Dr. Levy, Dr. Bader, what was your reaction when you first heard about this term, forced organ harvesting?
Let me try and start, Thorsten. Good evening, everybody. I guess you and everybody else still remember the case that brought me into DAFO and into the research and advocating the issue against forced organ harvesting. And this was already back in 2005. This was a patient of mine who has been admitted at our Department of Cardiac Surgery at the Sheba Medical Center, and he has been waiting for more than 9 months for a suitable heart donor to become available, and we couldn't find a suitable heart donor for him. And one day he approached me on rounds and told me, "Doc, I have to tell you that I'm fed up waiting in Israel for a suitable donor to become available." And I was told by my insurance company that I should fly to China because I'm scheduled to undergo a heart transplantation in 2 weeks' time. And he mentions a date 2 weeks ahead. And I looked at him and asked him, are you listening to yourself? How can anyone promise you a heart transplant ahead of time? You do understand that for a heart transplant to take place, somebody has to die on the very same day, and his family has to give their consent for the heart donation in order to be transplanted in your chest. And he told, look, I don't know. That's what my insurance company told me. And sure enough, the patient flew to China and underwent his heart transplantation exactly on the day that he was promised 2 weeks earlier. So this was my first encounter with this. I heard previous years from my colleagues, the kidney transplant surgeons, that a lot of Israelis went to China and came back with a kidney. Being a heart transplant surgeon, I never paid too much attention, and I thought that this was a Chinese poor farmer who sold one of his 2 kidneys in order to better the economic situation of his family. Not that this is legal or okay, but I never paid too much attention. The fact that you can get a heart in a date that is set 2 weeks ahead of time, that was a whole different story. And that was the first time that I learned about in 1984. Already in 1984, the secret Chinese law which permits the use of organs from executed prisoners. This was even a year before the issue of Falun Gong has been discovered for the first time by David Matas and David Kilgore. So that was the first time that I was personally involved with this.
Yeah, definitely. This appears to be like a forceful or coerced procurement of a heart as a donor organ. Dr. Bader, anything to add?
Yeah, just from my perspective, welcome everyone. I think the immediate reaction for me as an ethicist, and also, by the way, I'm a pediatric critical care physician, retired, is the fact that murder is occurring for the benefit of someone else. And that utilitarian view just doesn't make any sense, that murder would trump engaging in getting another organ for someone who's in dire need. That just doesn't fit. You know, the whole aspect of sacrificing a Falun Gong member comes without their consent. Is there even coercion? From my understanding, there isn't even that. There just is no consent or even notification that this is happening. At the same time, I have great difficulty with the ethics of the individual who is pursuing the organ donation, knowing what that entails. You know, to be naive and say that they don't really know how that's going to occur just doesn't make any sense to me either. So on both sides, we have an organ recipient who is just as much at fault in being complicit in a murder of someone as the surgeons who are doing this. So I think this really entails, a whole aspect. Now, I need to temper the comment that I make about the organ recipient being complicit. The issue is, individuals wait years and years and years, as was mentioned, for an organ. And they reach the end of the rope and they said, look, I need to move forward or I'm going to die. And so I'll do anything I can. Is there a judgment issue in that perspective? Is there a way for us to be judgmental in that and saying, well, I can kind of see where that person's coming from? That entails bias, and that entails, being judgmental in terms of, yeah, maybe it may be okay. But I think the long and short of it is my reaction is centers around the whole concept of murdering someone for the benefit of someone else, and the complicity of perhaps the organ recipient in knowing that that's going to occur.
Yeah, I think you are right. It turns the medical profession into an absurd practice if treatment is paid off by killing somebody, and it even goes beyond the ethical aspect here, because as you indicate, it is a criminal act. It is killing. let me go to the next question, which I would like to address to Dr. Gilcrease and Dr. Centurion. Witnesses and investigators found that Falun Gong practitioners were particularly susceptible to forced organ harvesting. Why were Falun Gong practitioners so vulnerable? Do you believe China's rapid growth in the transplant field would have been possible if the Chinese government had not used Falun Gong practitioners as a live organ donor pool? This is a complex question. It entails the whole aspect here in one. Maybe let me summarize it in one phrase. What role do you think did the persecution of Falun Gong play in facilitating the forced organ harvesting?
Yeah, that's a great question. First of all, thank you for allowing me to be part of this very distinguished panel. It's really wonderful to be here today, and thank you to the audience as well. Your question, Torsten, is could forced organ harvesting have ever occurred if the Chinese Communist Party had not illegally banned the practice of Falun Gong back in 1999? And I'll also kind of trail off of Dr. Beta, one of my good friends, his comments about murder for parts. So to give some history of forced organ harvesting, I think there's a couple of things to note. If you look at the Tribunal report that Professor Elliott, who's on the panel today, was part of, if you look at the original report from 2006 by David Matus and David Kilgore, two Canadians, and if you look at the update that was done in 2016, we're talking about 1,483 pages of data, predominantly Chinese data, that is confirming that Falun Gong are indeed being murdered for their organs. And how do you get there? So I often think of the evidence or the data around forced organ harvesting as a large train that's kind of sailing down these rails. And one rail is understanding the history of transplant in China, or the lack thereof. And then the other rail is understanding the persecution of Falun Gong, because you cannot have forced organ harvesting, in my opinion, without a large population of depersonalized, dehumanized, demonized human beings in China that are essentially looked at as non-persons or subhumans, not only by the community at large and by the government, but also by the medical community. So how did we get there? In 1984, the Chinese government passed a regulation that's still on the books as far as I know, basically giving a pseudo-legal framework that allows for using executed criminals for their organs. So we knew this was happening in the 1990s, despite, as Professor Levy had sort of alluded to, this is also an unethical practice. But we knew that the Chinese government was doing this. Why? Well, in Chinese society, there's this Confucius principle that the body must stay intact going into the next life. This is out of respect for your mother and your father and the body that they've given. So if you think about that, the body must not be disrupted at death. And because of that, transplant really didn't exist in China. There was no formal organ donation or distribution system, as Professor Levy's recent paper from April in the American Journal of Transplantation points out, until 2015, when the Chinese government or the Chinese medical profession set up a sort of a pseudo organ donation system. So you have this law or regulation on the books in 1984. In the 1990s, you have executed criminals and using their organs for transplant, which is going to supply a very small amount. This is not a healthy population. And the code in China only allows 1 week to kill a criminal if they're condemned to death. So you switch in 1999, when the Chinese government bans the practice of Falun Gong, a Buddhist, a very peaceful practice, and the Chinese government numbers were that 70 to 100 million people were practicing. So if you have 1% of that population in detention centers, labor camps, prisons at any given time, you're talking about several 100,000 up to 1 million people in detention centers at any given time. And this is Ethan Gutman's estimate of the number of people, the number of Falun Gong practitioners, that were in prisons and detention centers. And again, they are so successfully dehumanized by the government that they're really looked at as subhuman. And so you switch from people that are actually condemned to death to people that are not condemned to death. They're simply prisoners of the state. When they're being detained, the stories are coming out over and over and over again that as they're being detained and put into labor camps and undergoing torture, they're also undergoing these abnormal medical tests. And essentially, they're becoming the de facto organ bank for the Chinese system. So I don't think you can have it, you can't have forced organ harvesting without a large population spread throughout China, different ethnicities within China, but geographically spread throughout China, and a population that the Chinese government and the Chinese people and the medical system really doesn't recognize as human being or as human beings. And so when you look at it, you switch from an execution that is going to take place and trying to get organs out of that executed criminal based on this 1984 law to actually typing. And then, just as Professor Levy's patient very likely had a Falun Gong practitioner back in 2005, who was typed and was an appropriate heart for that patient, and then was essentially killed on demand on that exact date and at that exact time when they were promised a heart. So I don't think you can have you really can't have forced organ harvesting without a government that is organizing this awful persecution. And Falun Gong are a very vulnerable population, and I'll let Dr. Centurion describe why they were such a vulnerable population, and I'll go ahead and stop there.
Yeah, I think you bring up a very important train of thought here. China claims to started its public organ donation program in 2013. That means before 2013, there was not even a public organ donation program. And so without organs, how can you, I assume the transplant surgeons on the panel will agree, how can you transplant an organ if you don't have an organ donor available? So and then in this setting, you have the persecution, which has led to the dehumanization. So this is, how would that be possible before the organ donation pool program even started? Dr. Centurion, any thoughts to add?
Oh, yes. Well, first of all, thank you for allowing me to be here today amongst this distinguished panel. So that was an excellent summary, Dr. Gilcrease. One comment I'd like to make is, first of all, the number of transplants in China cannot be explained by the number of executed criminals. And this is one of the arguments of the Chinese government. They wanted the people, the world, to believe that the executed criminals were the explanation for all these transplants they were doing. But if you look at the number, if you know, the voluntary donation in China, there was only, like, from 1970s to 2010, there's about only 130 voluntary donations. So voluntary donation does not explain the transplants in China at that time. And the executed criminals, even though they passed a law in 1984 that allowed for the use of executed criminals, we don't see a rapid increase in the number of transplants during the next 15 years, from 1984 all the way till the early 2000s, when this transplant explosion occurs. So this transplant explosion, you see an increase in organs in China from 3,000 or so all the way up to 10 to 12,000 organs. It's a 300% increase in number of transplants. In the rest of the world, you see about a 10 to 15% increase in that same period of time. So this is an unprecedented increase in the number of transplants that can't be explained by the executed criminals. Also, partly, if you would expect the executed criminals to explain the transplants, you would expect the number of transplants, the number of executed criminals, which is, a state secret, would expect the number of transplants, executed criminals, to be going up to explain that explosion. But in fact, what we see is that the number of executed criminals was decreasing due to some changes in the laws in China, where they took the power away from the provincial courts, and only the Supreme Court was able to issue death sentences. So there's really, the executed criminals do not explain that transplant explosion that we see in China in the early 2000s. And then just circling back about the question about the vulnerability, the Falun Gong was very vulnerable, partly because the numbers of people that were practicing, there were estimated about 100 million people practicing, and then practice is rooted in traditional Chinese culture. This is the same culture that the Cultural Revolution tried to eradicate, and the party was threatened not only by the numbers of people practicing, but ideologically. These were people were practicing. The principles were truthfulness, compassion, and tolerance, and these are principles that are completely opposite of Chinese ideology, which is atheist, and it's intolerant, it's evil in nature, and is lies about everything. So and there was also the fact that many of the people that practicing at the time were members of the Communist Party, and it was throughout the whole society. There were people in the party, doctors, lawyers, peasants, the whole walks of life were practicing this. So the government felt threatened, particularly since there were many Communist Party members who were practicing these beliefs which were spiritual in nature, which again are antithetical to the Communist Party ideology. So unfortunately, because of this, there was this horrible persecution that began, and they were demonized, dehumanized, and were labeled enemies of the state, and they were targets for elimination. So that's what I wanted to share. Thank you.
Yeah, very interesting. I think the arbitrary dehumanization for the belief in principles, truthfulness, compassion, forbearance, which seem to be opposite to the Communist Party, which has its own characteristic in this regard. I think this opposition to these principles has led to this dehumanization, and I think we will talk about this a little bit later in a different context. Let me introduce our next theme and question, which I will address to Dr. Elliott and Dr. Lavie. In 2006, the first investigators, David Kilgore and David Matters, conducted phone interviews with doctors in Chinese hospitals. And in more than a dozen cases, the doctors mentioned that they used fresh organs from living Falun Gong practitioners for transplants. Organs that they were able to procure actually in a short time, typically in less than 2 weeks, as the case from Dr. Lavie already indicated. Dr. Elliott, you are one of the members of the China Tribunal that reviewed the large amount of evidence of forced live organ harvesting accumulated over many years. As a surgeon yourself, what was your reaction when you first learned about these phone interviews and the short wait times for organs?
Well, thank you, A, for allowing me to take part in this. And also, I'd like to thank all the people who submitted evidence and those who spoke at the tribunal, sometimes at great personal risk, to tell us about what was happening in China. I think it's really important at the outset to say that this is not about Chinese people. This is about the Chinese Communist Party's control over a system. And it's very easy to sound racist, actually. And I think it's inappropriate to do that. I think we should concentrate very much on what's happened as a result of a system. This is a system which has put millions of people into camps over a very number of decades and continues so to do. And the evil that we hear about, and it was that the thought that I first felt when I heard about this, was that this is some form of evil. And if it is a form of evil, where does it sit on a spectrum? And that's quite a hard thing. These people have been put into camps and, as you say, dehumanized. And we heard evidence of mild, extreme, gross, severe sexual violence, culminating in death, and often stories which led us to conclude that forced organ harvesting had in fact taken place. So horror, the existence of evil, and frankly, something I'd never heard about when I started to be involved. So that was my initial reaction. We were almost unwilling to believe it and took a very cautious approach to the evidence. which was extremely weighty, collected by very brave people for a long period of time. But in the end, the disparity between the number of official donors and the number of transplants, the short waiting times, and the financial transactions which were exposed by the telephone calls made it impossible for us to conclude anything other than it was taking place. And for those of you watching who haven't read this evidence, all of the evidence we saw and read and heard is available on the China Tribunal website, chinatribunal.com, and you can make your own conclusions from the same evidence that we read, if you have any doubt at all. But my first thought, the question you first asked me, was that this was horrific and an evil, and as a transplant surgeon myself, the question of complicity, which you've already raised, several of you have raised, seems to me to be of paramount importance for the medical profession. And if I can just before Jay comes in, I also think that my own personal conclusion at the end of it was that we all have a moral and ethical duty in particularly in transplantation, which I think can be summed up by the word transparency, as well as all the basic rules about ethics. If you're working in the West, I use the West just generically rather than specifically geographically, but we would be expected to have a register of donors and a register of recipients, and anybody visiting from any other country would be able to track back against those two registers to the medical records and prove that the organs have gone to the right place in the right way. No one has been able to do that in China.
Yeah, I think you touched upon a very important point, which is usually actually not addressed. I actually haven't heard many addressing this point. You point out that China committed these crimes, but for some reason it's a taboo topic to address China as the culprit of the forced organ harvesting. It is more considered like China is doing it like many other countries, mixing the forced organ harvesting with commercial organ trafficking. But in terms of killing people for organs, China is the only country that is doing it. And not mentioning China would equate to talking about the Holocaust, but not mentioning Nazi Germany. I don't want to go directly in the direct comparison of this aspect here, but I think you're right. We need to learn to break through this taboo, and we need to have the courage to address the culprit. Dr. Lavie, any other comments?
Yeah, just to continue the same line of thought that Martin started. You asked to begin with, what was my reaction as a heart transplant surgeon when I first heard about the use of organs from executed prisoners and from Falun Gong practitioners? To say that I was shocked, this is obvious. I mean, the issue is, and this still goes on today, 17 years after I first heard about it, is that our colleagues, medical professionals all over the world, still today, 2022, find it hard after all the evidence gathered by the China Tribunal and after all the hundreds of papers published about it, our colleagues still find it hard to believe that our colleagues back in China are taking part in these atrocities. As physician, as surgeon, and mainly as transplant surgeon, you can hardly imagine that our colleagues are taking live people to the operating theater, and by extracting their organs, heart, lungs, liver, kidneys, they actually execute them. So it wasn't only hard back then at the beginning to grasp and to believe that this is going on. It's still hard to believe even today. And that's part of our problem. I'm talking us as a group of physicians who are trying to advocate about the issues of forced organ harvesting, to make our colleagues here in the West believe that these atrocities are actually taking place. And that's our difficulty.
Yeah, very very true. Very, very important.
Can I come back into Austin?
Sure.
One of the very interesting things that was, I feel like, exposed when we were gathering the evidence was that people feel a very strong, people who have trained people who now work in China or travel backwards and forwards themselves to work in China from well-recognized institutions outside that country, build partnerships with them, feel an immense loyalty and become extraordinarily defensive and resistant to the evidence which has been forthcoming. And that personal loyalty, it's easy to understand. We've all had trainees that we love and admire and want to see do better than we did. We've always wanted to work with other countries. The partnerships we build are what build research and innovation. So it's completely natural to want to do it. The follow-up is that it makes it very difficult for those people to believe that anything bad can happen around their friends. And yet when I've been to China, when others have been to China, you have a very sanitized view of the system compared with what was exposed to us during the China Tribunal. So I think we need to consider whether or not we, those of us outside China, exposed to what goes on in China, are being told or are able to see what is really going on without the kind of investigative journalistic techniques which have been employed leading up to the China Tribunal. It's a very difficult form of evidence which most medics aren't used to dealing with.
Can I just add something to Dr. Levy's comments?
Sure.
Real quick. At our College of Medicine, Phoenix, we have held 2 seminars on this topic. And we approached our transplant physicians, surgeons, and transplant physicians, asking them if they would like to be a part of this and be involved. And I'm just tagging on to Dr. Levy. We heard, and we witnessed a lot of hesitancy on the part of the transplant physicians. And, I may be throwing our community under the bus, but there was one transplant surgeon who did participate, but many others either did not know about this and didn't want to know about it, and were unwilling to engage, and for whatever reasons. But it was frightening to me to hear that and to see that. We have a very robust transplant program here in Phoenix, both for pediatrics and adults. But it was surprising to me. So I'm just throwing that out. It's I'm not. This is not confidential. We all knew. We brought it up at the seminar. So I just wanted to tag on to Dr. Levy's comments. Thanks.
Yeah, actually, this is very interesting. I see a connection between what Dr. Elliott and Dr. Bader just mentioned, and this is like loyalty, either loyal to the nation or loyal to the profession, loyalty, and the aspect of complicity. Yeah, so we have basically, there's a decision process that is needed. Are we loyal? If we are loyal, then we might actually be complicit because we are covering up what others understand as a crime. So I think this is a question that the transplant profession has to face sooner or later. I would like to continue with the next theme and question, which I will address to Dr. Bader and Dr. Gilcrease. And that is, after the news about this crime against humanity broke in 2006, one would have expected that the media would have reported widely on this sensational news, that the WHO and the UN Human Rights Council or other international bodies would have called for investigations otherwise. Instead, we witnessed a wave of silence, specifically an institutional silence. It was individual researchers, individuals who took the lead to investigate and collect and present data and their findings to the world. In 2016, 10 years after the first news about forced organ harvesting broke, the book, An Unprecedented Evil Persecution, was published. It highlighted how the Chinese government has successfully infiltrated or influenced different organizations and professions in our society to effectuate this institutionalized silence. Have you had personal experience with censorship on this topic in your field? Or what do you feel has been the ripple effect of such silence?
I guess I'll go ahead and start. I think a couple of things. I think Dr. Elliott pointed out very well that this can be something that's perceived as racist, or that you're attacking a specific people. And I'll share a couple of my personal stories, but it is important to point out that the Chinese Communist Party has only been in power in China since 1949. And during the Cultural Revolution from 1966 to 1976, they completely decimated their traditional cultures. And so when you're saying that the Chinese Communist Party is tightly involved in some of the most horrific human rights abuses and medical abuses that we've ever seen, or that I've at least seen in my lifetime, you're not attacking the Chinese people. You're actually doing the opposite. You're trying to stand for the basic rights of those human beings and the basic dignity of basic rights that we all enjoy in the West. So the question of what does that censorship look like? And Dr. Beta has already spoken a little bit about this, but I know one of my personal stories when I went to some of our most senior leadership at our university, and I said, I wasn't even asking for action. I was asking for a simple conversation with the transplant community and with our legal community to sit down. And this is late 2019. So in late 2019, this is when Professor Elliott and the 6 other members of the tribunal came out and said, unanimously, and certainly beyond reasonable doubt, forced organ harvesting is taking place in China. So they all agreed, based on over 50 witnesses that they listened to, and just a significant amount of evidence. And I'll also add that the tribunal consistently asked for China to come and try to explain where their organs were coming from. And as far as I know, they had 0 responses from the Chinese medical community or the Chinese government. So the Chinese had the opportunity to say, this is where organs are coming from. So when I went to one of our senior leadership officials and said, look, we need to at least sit down and talk about it, and talk about our potential complicity, number one, in training people from China to come here, learn transplant, and go back to China and be involved in these crimes against humanity, or likely genocidal acts of killing innocent people for organs. I was essentially told there was no doubt that it was happening, but there was a concern that if we said anything as a medical center, that China would send all of their students to Texas. That was the response I was given. So I think there's real fear of economic retribution. I think there is fear of professional retribution. And so we're in a moment where we're sort of stuck in this very difficult moment. A week later, after I didn't hear from this particular physician and senior leader at our center, I emailed him and I said, hey, can we just follow up and have a discussion? And I was given this sort of nondescript email from the legal team saying, if you want to be involved in political advocacy, you essentially can't use your computer, and I'm using my own camera right now, by the way, but you can't use the University of Utah, you can't speak on their behalf. And so it then became framed as political advocacy, which I think is a real problem. I think this actually stands above politics. This is a human rights violation and a human rights issue and a bioethical issue that is so large and so difficult to tackle that it stands in my mind above this issue of politics. Even if it is a political body that has orchestrated this kind of criminal behavior, it still needs to be addressed by the medical community. This is our job to sort of keep our profession clean and transparent. That in my mind is a more formal type of censorship. I think the informal censorship has been brought up multiple times, and that is, I'm in a liver cancer clinic with a transplant surgeon, and when Professor Levy's report came out just this last April, showing that that these people that were getting transplants weren't brain dead, I brought it up, and this particular transplanter said, "Yeah, I know. My family has been reaching out to me about this, but this is going to look awful to the public." So I think there's also this fear and this informal sort of inability to talk about it because there is such a fear that if this gets out to the public, we're going to lose more public trust. And I think that's also an issue.
Yeah, I think this is very true. Very true.
Also, I can just add a true story. This was back in the year 2012. I was back then the president of the Israel Society of Transplantation, and for our annual meeting, I invited David Matas to come over from Canada and to give us his presentation about the entire issue of forced organ harvesting. And when one day, two days before the meeting, I got a call from our Ministry of Health telling me that they have got a call from our Ministry of Foreign Affairs, which got a call from the Chinese embassy in Israel asking us to prevent David Matas from presenting his presentation at the annual meeting. I told them right away, forget about it. David Matas is going to present. What I'm willing to do, I'm willing to give the floor to a representative of the Chinese embassy to bring up his case. And sure enough, after David Matas presented all the data that he presented in the Bloody Harvest report, the representative of Chinese embassy stood up and tried to to paint the entire presentation of David as an anti-communist propaganda. And he was literally booed by the entire 1,000 people in the audience and had to leave the stage because nobody would let him end his speech. So there was an attempt to block us, but sometimes you have to put your foot in the sand, so to speak, and say enough is enough.
That's a very interesting experience that you share here. I think the silence that we address here is going indeed almost into the area of censorship and manipulation, and it affects the medicine as a science, because when we don't have any problems to share research findings from all over the world. We are living in a global network of information, but then this information about the forced organ harvesting, that should be censored. It doesn't make sense. Yeah, Dr. Bader.
So just a comment on the censorship issue. I think we need to keep in mind that there's personal censorship as well. And that's what I was seeing within our community, is that individuals were personally censoring themselves in getting engaged in the discussion. And there were reasons for that I later found out. That number one, yes, sometimes it was institutional, because they were being censored and were told not to engage in that. But there was also personal censorship in terms of, and I'm going out on a limb, on terms of reputation. That if they went out and said what they should have said, they felt that they may have gained a reputation that was contrary to really who they were and what they truly believed. So that personal censorship was an individual concept that, in essence, ethically, is a significant issue. To personally censor yourself, even though you know what is happening is wrong, kind of goes along with the fact that you're not following the line of medical ethics and doing what is not only right, but doing what is best. So I think the censorship is a significant issue. The more personal you get with your personal censorship, the more complicit you become in the aspects of the unethical behavior on both sides.
Yeah, this is a very important point here. You draw the connection between the institutional silence that transfers into an institutional censorship, and that puts so much pressure on the individual that the individual then agrees to self-censor. It's like a vicious cycle. And I think the example from Jay just now, it's telling us that the way to break through this self-censorship is to stand up together and to have the courage to express oneself and say, well, enough is enough. This goes too far. I'm not willing to self-censor myself. I know better. This is the truth. I'm a scientist. I follow the data that I acquired from statistics or other research, and I have the courage to stand for that, and I'm not agreeing to go into self-censorship. I think that's a very important insight.
Torsten, can I come in briefly? Because I was recently involved in some work that was done by Global Rights Compliance. I don't know if you've heard of that group, which is a group of lawyers trying to help particularly medical and academic institutions and industry as well find some essentially forms of words which would allow them to underwrite their legal relationships with Chinese authorities and so on. For example, many Western universities and professional bodies have strong financial reasons to be closely associated with China, not only with the number of students they teach, but also licensing those institutions within China. So the Global Rights Compliance, I'm sorry, I'm looking at my screen to read this out, but they recognize that any of these organizations, academic, medical, and business, need to do three things to ensure that they have an appropriate ethical framework. First, they need to establish a human rights commitment within their own organizations to prevent involvement in unethical practices, including transplantation. Second, that they must conduct human rights due diligence processes to identify, prevent, mitigate, and account for unethical medical and transplantation risks. And third, that they should disengage from any relationship where such unethical transplantation is not preventable, not mitigatable, or not remediable. Now, that seems to me to be extremely important construct, because it transfers the accountability from searching the problem in China to those people who are actually dealing with them as groups. It's much easier for a group of lawyers to pressurize institutions at that level than it is for us as individuals or for individuals working one-on-one with surgeons in China when you don't see the truth. So I think this is a very important step. And so it's the Global Rights Compliance. You can find it on their website. And then just before I leave that, there was one other book which I can recommend, which is called, I'll just find it again, Hidden Hand. And it was written by, I lost it again, Clive Hamilton and Marika Olberg, Hidden Hand, which is exploring at greater length what somebody mentioned earlier about the mode by which China is infiltrating our organizations elsewhere outside China as part of the Belt and Road Initiative. And the influence they have is massive and makes very many universities extremely fearful of doing what was just suggested to us a few moments ago by David.
Torsten, if I may just continue directly to Martin's idea and to give an example of what we have done recently at the International Society of Heart and Lung Transplantation, of which I'm a member of the ethics committee. We changed the ethics statement recently, just a month ago, of the society, whereby blocking, once again, the society from any research, any presentation, any paper in any organ transplantation, specifically thoracic organ transplantation for the ISHLT, coming from China. So no Chinese transplant surgeon who's doing heart or lung transplantation can either submit papers to the Journal of Heart and Lung Transplantation. No such surgeon or physician can come to the annual meeting of the society. As we have seen in the past, such an academic boycott is very important. It's a very powerful tool for us as physicians to exert some pressure over our colleagues in China to express the way that we think what they are doing. So if other societies, international society, would have followed this paradigm, I think we as a group of physicians could have some impact once again on what's going on in China.
Yeah, I think this is a great example of taking responsibility and being courageous as an medical organization. And it not only sends a signal to China, but another aspect is that the profession or the organization keeps up its standards and is rejecting any dilution of ethical standards and decay of the standards. So I think it's very important to uphold the purity of the profession. Let me go to my next theme and question. In 2018, a team of authors published the academic article called Genocide, Falun Gong in China, which revealed the Chinese government had pursued an eradication campaign against Falun Gong. But because it has occurred in a slow motion and in a covert manner, it has remained largely undetected by the international community. After the Tiananmen student massacre in 1989, the international community responded with strong and united actions that isolated China economically. There was a profound lesson for the communist government in Beijing. Hence, the eradication campaign against Falun Gong needed a different format. It couldn't go the same way as the student massacre. Executions were hence delegated from the courtroom to the operating room, from policemen to transplant surgeons. Subsequently, this profitable transplant practice created a self-propelling dynamic to keep surgeons motivated to make use of the forced organ harvesting. To meet the definition of a genocide, intent is a criterion. How would you argue to show that the communist leadership acted with intent in the eradication campaign against Falun Gong through this whole dynamic in the transplant field? Maybe Dr. Centurion, would you start?
Yeah, I think that from all the evidence we have, I think it's important to understand who initiated the persecution of Falun Gong. As you mentioned, the Tiananmen massacre occurred in 1989, and the leader that came right after that was Jiang Zemin, who was an extreme hardliner, and he was actually the leader at the time that the Falun Gong persecution began. He's the person that initiated the persecution in July 1999. And after, when he initiated the persecution, he issued an order that was read out to all the thousands of party members at the Great Hall there in Beijing, where he said specifically to ruin their reputation, to bankrupt them financially, and to eliminate them physically. So this order clearly showed the intent to eliminate Falun Gong, both on a spiritual level as well as physically, which is consistent with the genocide. The part of the campaign was carried out. They created this office called the 610 office, which has branches all throughout China, and this was charged with carrying out the persecution, which again has been well documented in all the different human rights groups. We know that Ethan Gutman said there's like 1 million or so Falun Gong practitioners in labor camps at the time. So there was the arbitrary detentions. There's been millions of thousands of documented that have been tortured to death, and the UN has documented this. One of the special rapporteurs for torture said that 66% or so of the victims of torture in China at the time were Falun Gong practitioners. So there's clearly an element of intent to eliminate Falun Gong through this directive that Jiang Zemin issued, and also there's evidence from the human rights organizations as well. And as far as forced organ harvesting, there's also evidence from the intent there that there's also a desire to eliminate this group. And one of the important factors to realize, as we talked about, is that forced organ harvesting is not a black market or practice. This is carried out by the state itself. The Communist Party runs the transplant centers, it runs the labor camps, they control the military, and it's the PLA, the military, that runs the camp for all these practitioners, are the donor bank of China. And they are the ones that will supply the organs to the commercial hospitals, as well as civilian hospitals, as well as the military hospitals. And there's another piece of evidence is that the Falun Gong were targeted specifically, and they're not targeting common prisoners. And this is evidenced by one of the pieces of evidence is the blood tests that are being done to practitioners of Falun Gong, as well as other prisoners of conscience like the Uyghurs, Tibetans, Christians. The blood tests are necessary, we know, to blood type and tissue type, and to create this donor bank to be able to then use them as donors. But common prisoners are not known to do. They're not known to do this to common prisoners. The UN just last year issued credible evidence that this is again happening to prisoners of conscience, Falun Gong, and other groups, but not to common prisoners. So there's evidence that they are directing the forced organ harvesting to these groups. And there's also the fact that forced organ harvesting is carried out on an industrial scale. There are, we don't know the exact numbers, but we're estimated from the China Tribunal 60 to 90,000 transplants a year. Last 20 years, we're looking at 1 million or perhaps more victims potentially. So this industrial scale shows that they're trying to kill Falun Gong on a large scale. And I would argue that this intent is part of the consistent with the definition of genocide, where they're trying to kill at least a part of the group or the entire group. So I think the intent is clear in that evidence.
Your train of thought. You started by quoting the intent or the wording that was given out by the leader Jiang Zemin to destroy Falun Gong practitioners physically. That is the verbal expression of the intent, and then afterwards we see targeted actions where specifically Falun Gong practitioners in detention camps were selected for blood tests, and there's this 610 office that is only set up to persecute Falun Gong. So we see a verbalized intent and actions that underline the intent. Weldon, do you have any other thoughts on this?
Yeah, I mean, I guess just to be clear, the cold genocide term that in this particular paper essentially is referring to the fact that this isn't people out getting butchered with machetes openly. I mean, this is happening. This is sort of happening in, as you said, in operating rooms or operating theaters throughout China. I guess that the issue for me, as I read the tribunal's judgment, was, that I know that based on legal counsel, and I'm not a legal expert, but that there was this issue of intent, not saying it met the definition of a genocide, but it met crimes against humanity. And I just don't know, for me as a physician, I don't know if the distinction is that important. In my mind, that you pick a particular group, the Falun Gong, and now the Uyghurs, because once that report came out in 2006 that Falun Gong were being killed for their organs, I think you just don't allow the 1.5 million or maybe more in concentration camps now in Xinjiang in Western China, these Uyghur individuals that are now likely subjected to forced organ harvesting. This has just continued to happen with these populations that, in my view, China's trying to extinguish. There are 13 million, I believe, Uyghurs in Western China. Again, there were 70 to 100 million Falun Gong practitioners in 1999. I think the Freedom House now estimates that there's still roughly 20 million in China that are practicing. And the difficulty with Falun Gong, and I think to kind of answer an earlier question, why are they so vulnerable? Well, it's not an organization. It's not a formal organization with buildings and things that the Chinese Communist Party can track. It's a spiritual practice of mind and body based on truth and compassion and tolerance. And a lot of the Buddhist sort of ideology that permeated traditional Chinese culture and ancient Chinese culture, that becomes difficult to get a campaign to eradicate them. But the Chinese Communist Party was very successful at doing this, and predominantly because in 2001 they staged this Tiananmen Square self-immolation hoax where 5 people lit themselves on fire and they claimed it was Falun Gong. So that 610 office that you mentioned that was formulated on June 10th or 6/10 of 1999, not only are they out as the Gestapo trying to persecute Falun Gong specifically, but they're also trying to propagandize and change not just the public opinion within China, but globally.
Yeah.
Sorry, Torsten, the legal argument around genocide is extremely complicated. The law itself, as you will know, only emerged after the Nuremberg trials. And if you want to read about the evolution of that law, there's an extremely good book called East-West Street by Philippe Sands, who's a British lawyer whose father was at medical school, at law school with the person who drafted the law on genocide, but also in the same law class, the Nazi who was in charge of eliminating the Jews in that part of Ukraine. They were all in the same law class. Extraordinary concatenation of people. But much of the debate was about this business of intent. And the lawyers, multiple lawyers that we consulted, felt that that speech by Jiang Zemin was not sufficient in its own right to state that that was intent. And that was simply the conclusion that they reached legally would not pass the get through court test. Whereas for the Uyghur Tribunal, they have concluded that there was genocide. Now, I'm personally not so sure it does make a whole lot of difference. It was part of an enormous spectrum of evil, from just imprisonment through to death, and whether the death of an individual is less important than the death of 10 individuals and 1,000 individuals is a very complicated ethical question. To me, the very fact that you're prepared to put these people in a camp is as bad in many ways, because you have taken that fundamental step of excluding them from society for no cause, other than your choice of whether what they believe in is right or wrong. From there, it's just a slippery slope. The evil is progressive, as even the CIA reported to what happened in Abu Ghraib. The doctors who were involved in all of the torture crimes there were on a slippery slope. It could happen to all of us. And I remember one great quote after the Nuremberg trials. These were people like us, like each of us sitting here in this room today. Doctors, academics, we are all capable of sliding down that slippery slope. We have a moral duty to ourselves not to get on the slide. But whether genocide is more important than the murder of an individual is always going to be debated, as it was in Nuremberg. And the lawyers will have a field day. In the end, we've got to stop the initial practice as well as the final practice.
Yeah, I think it has something. It is related to the attention and awareness. I mentioned the student massacre. It was very obvious that this was a horrific atrocity because it was just so visible. And if you go to other so-called hot genocides, they are visible. There's immediate destruction, and it is it is easier to witness and to observe. But in this case, I believe that a cold genocide, a slow-moving genocide, is more difficult to detect, and it requires a different set of criteria. But I think, Jay, yeah?
No, exactly on that particular point that you just brought up and the previous speakers, I think it's appropriate that we spend a few words on the Chinese declaration as if as of January 1st, 2015, they have stopped completely the use of organs from executed prisoners. Remember that until this very day, nobody in China ever admitted that they've been using Falun Gong. They only admitted previously using formerly executed prisoners, and they have declared as if this practice has stopped. Now, it's important here to stress that all of us know, but for the purpose of our audience, that we have a lot of evidence that this practice has not stopped according to in contradiction to what the Chinese have been declaring. We know that the numbers since 2015, the number of organ transplantation have increased tremendously. Even I just referred to one paper that we published back in 2019 with my colleague Matthew Robertson, based upon official Chinese numbers of organ transplantation and have shown that all these numbers are totally manipulated, fabricated, and we know for a fact that the number of beds, transplant hospital beds, have increased tremendously, incrementally, since 2015. So there's no way the number of organ transplantation, which the Chinese admit themselves, can be explained just by voluntary organ donation, which has admittedly just started in China. So it's very important to stress that in spite of the Chinese declaration, this practice of using organs from whatever kind of prisoners, being official prisoners or prisoners of conscience, as we call them, hasn't stopped.
Yeah, since you mentioned your research, Jay, would you mind to because this takes us more into the present now, that the research didn't end with the China Tribunal, and the China Tribunal did a fantastic job to collect all the evidence up to that day, to present it and to review it at one point. But actually the research continued afterwards, and you were one of the co-authors who presented actually 2 papers in 2019 and 2022. Do you mind to elaborate a little bit more on this, Jay?
Yeah, just very briefly, in the recent research, which again done by Matthew Robertson, my colleague, the Australian colleague, and myself, published in the American Journal of Transplantation, we examined the Chinese adherence to the dead donor rule, which is, for the purpose of in the audience who are not transplant physicians, is the most fundamental ethical rule in transplant ethics, and it states that organ procurement must not commence until the donor is both dead and formally pronounced so, and by the same token that procurement of organs must not cause the death of the donor. And if the dead donor rule is not strictly adhered to, then it creates the fact that the surgeons procuring the organs become the executioners of the so-called donors. And while Matthew Robertson is fluent in Chinese, we set up in a computational text analysis of almost 3,000 Chinese language transplant papers and looked for proof that the donors have not been proclaimed brain dead before organ procurement has started. And as the audience should be aware of, one of the essential requirements to declare brain death is the performance of the apnea test, which simply stated is a test where you disconnect the patient whom you think is already brain dead. You disconnect him from the ventilator to which he is connected by an endotracheal tube. This is a tube that's inserted into the windpipe, and you look whether or not the patient starts breathing spontaneously. And if he does not, after a while, and this can take 8 or even 10 minutes, then and only then you can declare him as brain dead. And we have found in this computational text analysis more than 70 papers in which the authors by themselves admit that the organ procuring surgery has started before brain death has been formally declared, before the apnea test has been declared, because they mentioned that the intubation of these patients has been done only after the beginning of the organ procuring, which means that these surgeons were actually executing those patients, those prisoners, and by their Chinese own admission during these years, they can only be prisoners. The surgeons have become the actual executioners of these patients. Now, the last paper that we found in this research dates back to 2015, and we are always asked, "Hey, so this may represent the fact that the Chinese are right in their declarations that as of 2015, organs are not being taken anymore from executed prisoners." We don't think so. We think that because of the awareness of in the West by the China Tribunal and as such about the way organs are being procured in China, orders have been given to all the Chinese language journals to be very aware of any papers that will show the use of organs from people who are not being declared brain dead. So I think that by the fact that we found these more than 70 papers spread over more than 25 years all over the country, this is a final proof that the Chinese transplant physicians are actually taking active part in executing these patients.
Yeah, and you cannot forget in this context that you were only looking into academically published papers, and there may be other cases in other hospitals that were not used for these papers and research. So there may be even more undocumented cases that go right along the path that you have shown.
Absolutely, you're right.
And actually, in 2019, you did another analysis, a statistical forensic analysis of the donor system, and that was also a very powerful finding. Maybe do you want to elaborate a little bit?
Yeah, as I mentioned before, we examined again the official Chinese numbers of organ transplantation done since 2015, since the year they have declared as if they have stopped using organs from executed prisoners, and by showing statistically that they've placed all these numbers according to a mathematical formula that cannot be done in any way or shape in the system of organ transplantation. The numbers that the Chinese have published officially are 3, 4, or 5 times higher than any other country in the world. And again, this is a system that only recently has started using voluntary organs. So by analyzing the numbers published by the Chinese Red Cross and the Chinese Central Organ of Transplantation, we've shown that all these numbers have been manipulated so as to show the increase, which cannot be explained otherwise unless they are continuing to use organs from executed people.
Yeah, this might be the reason why we observe this lack of consistent, systematic lack of transparency, because only with transparency all these manipulation would be more obvious. But since we face this lack of transparency, we have to come up with new ideas, and I think this statistical analysis was just an ingenious idea to break through this lack of transparency. I would like to maybe, let me see. Let me talk a little bit about the society and what we face in the society. There are parliaments around the world that have sporadically acted on this matter of forced organ harvesting. The US Congress has passed resolutions and currently has 2 bills circulating in the House. The UK Parliament recently passed a bill, and the European Parliament also passed another resolution just recently. Why there are these supportive actions in some countries and from some selected politicians, we have not seen actions by international bodies like the United Nations or the UN Human Rights Council or the World Health Organization that independently and seriously looks into this issue. Can we as a human society afford to stay ignorant about the crimes of a totalitarian regime that persecutes millions of people and simply harvests their organs? Where will we as humankind be if we tolerated such atrocities? Where would we end up? Maybe, David, do you want to comment on this?
Yeah, sure. I think it just comes down again to complicity. We have to make personal decisions as to where we want to engage in our moral foundation and our ethics as it relates to others. To kind of shy away from doing what is right and doing what is best just takes away from the stability of our moral and ethical foundations. We just need to be cognizant of that and be open enough and transparent enough to say, yeah, things just aren't right, and I'm willing to stand stand by that comment and that position. One of the ways that we can perhaps do that is understanding that a person is a person no matter what, whether you're Falun Gong, whether you're, what have you. In other words, it's not about the what, it's about the who. Who are people? They're persons. And just to kind of look at it from that perspective, I think strengthens our moral and ethical foundation to be there and to be open and transparent and being there as advocates. So I don't think we should tolerate what's going on. My concern is that unless individuals are actively engaged in the atrocity, for example, either they're part of it or they live it, they're not necessarily going to be that interested. Look at what's happening in different parts of the world. How many people are really engaged in what's happening in Sudan, in the atrocities in Ukraine and all of that? If we're not living it, we have a tendency to kind of push it aside and maybe put it in a breadbasket and just kind of let it sit there for a bit. So I think from my perspective, our strong moral and ethical foundation centers around understanding always that a person is a person no matter what, that we need to be tolerant and just be advocates for human persons. And I actually move away from human beings to human persons.
Yeah, I think that is a very meaningful differentiation here, to talk about the person and not just the being. It makes it more personable to speak of the human person. And I think humankind is composed by human persons. In 2012, the German Medical Association officially apologized to the Jewish people for its participation in human rights violations under the Nazi regime. The apology included the admission that German doctors supported the Nazi ideology without being coerced to do so. Today, many Western doctors, transplant surgeons, and even medical associations choose, without coercion, to collaborate with the ethics-defined Chinese transplant marker. What would you tell the American Medical Association and the medical doctors in the United States what they should learn from the example of the German Medical Association? And I think, Jay, you earlier mentioned this example of the whole group of doctors standing up. Maybe you want to talk a little bit about the responsibility and the courage to speak up.
Yeah, I was previously a member of the International Transplantation Society Ethics Committee and what's called the Declaration of Istanbul Custodian Group. That's a group of international group of physicians that was made up after the Declaration of Istanbul was declared back in 2008 in Istanbul against organ trafficking and transplant tourism. And although the TTS, the Transplantation Society, was very vocal, pushing China to declare the cease of use of organs from executed prisoners, once in 2015, the Chinese, as I mentioned earlier, declared as if they've totally stopped using that. From that day onward, TTS totally, from one day to the other, changed its policy and adopted back the Chinese Medical Society and Chinese transplant physician back into the West, allowing them back to present papers, to submit, to bring presentation and submit papers to the journals, without, as you just mentioned, Torsten, without asking them to say nothing about what they've done so far. Even if you believe that these atrocities have stopped, I mean, all these people who have just, I mean, the leader of the current leader of the transplantation organization, Dr. Jifu Wang, a liver transplant surgeon by profession, is still running the transplant business in China. And this physician himself, as we have shown in a paper a few years ago, while doing a liver transplant, asked for four livers to be brought into the operating room and wait in the icebox in case something goes wrong. And he's still leading the current leader of the Chinese organ transplantation. So nothing, as you've just mentioned, Torsten, nothing is being asked by Western Society of Transplantation and by International Medical Association like the WHO. Nothing is being asked of China to repent, to say anything similar to what the German Medical Association has done following the atrocities done by German physicians during the Holocaust. So if that's the situation, that's depressing.
Yeah, it's a pity that that we did not learn enough from the past, that you cannot escape responsibility. Maybe you can cover it for a few years or decades, but at one point the responsibility will chase you, and then you have to speak up. In this regard, Martin, would you mind to elaborate a little bit on the China Tribunal and the importance of the conclusions and the judgment, in the sense, what would you tell the American Medical Association what they could learn from the China Tribunal?
That's a really hard question, except to say that everything is there to read. The conclusion is clear and the judgment made. And we made I should say that we made a decision as members of the tribunal not to campaign afterwards, which may, in the context of sitting around this table, seem a bit weird. But you never see a judge in a criminal trial going out and campaigning for the prosecution or for the defendant afterwards. The judgment stands in its own right, and we felt that that was the strongest position we could adopt. Therefore, I think that it is behoven on others, in fact, to use the findings of the China Tribunal to influence the politicians. I should say, though, that there is a global statement, which I've heard now, not just in my own country, but in many others from senior politicians, that trade trumps human rights. And the problems are being exposed immediately in Ukraine, where the supply chain issues that have occurred both during COVID and amplified by the Ukraine crisis push morals to the side. And first go morals, then go ethics. And I think that we're in a very dangerous time. If you do read the book Hidden Hands, you'll realize that many of the organizations that have been mentioned are chaired or financed by China. And they have the right of veto in several United Nations committees of great import. So really the only way that we felt that China Tribunal findings judgment could be used were by others taking that judgment and pressurizing their own governments and institutions and individual politicians to take action in the way that we've described. And I think that the practical example that I gave earlier from the global rights compliance is something that can really have an influence. Because if you're exporting drugs or pieces of equipment that are used in China for transplantation, and you realize that you're legally liable in your own country if you fail to carry out due diligence, I think that will carry weight. But these are details. The actual moral stance is one for the entire medical community to adopt, and all we can do is exert our influence as individuals whenever we get the opportunity.
Yeah, I think this is a very important differentiation here, and I think you draw the line at the right place. You say this is the judgment. It's not up to us to educate others. The judgment speaks for itself. Now it is up to the personal responsibility of each doctor. And I think this speaks to the responsibility of the medical profession. I think at this moment we are about to wrap up our questions, but I would like to give everyone maybe a few more time for a few sentences with the, let's say, with the question, what would you think, what would you suggest are the next steps, where we have to go? What would you say? do either the medical profession or politicians have to do to go forward with and make responsible use of of our knowledge? Maybe David, do you want to start?
Sure, I will. Thank you for that. And again, much appreciation for being part of this panel and for having all the participants here and moving forward with this. I think I've got two comments. One is, what have we learned from all of this? I think we're naive when we say we have not learned what has happened when you go back to the Holocaust and all that. What we choose is how we're going to use what we've learned. And I think that there has been a movement to move away from using what we've learned because it doesn't benefit ourselves or it can harm ourselves. So we don't do that. So from my perspective, what I encourage those who are willing to be bold and courageous enough to stand up and defend and be advocates of the atrocities that are occurring is to do a simple thing. Just look at themselves in the mirror. So look at yourself in the mirror and decide who you are. What would you like people to see who you are versus are people seeing what you are? And if they can distinguish the difference between the two, the who versus the what, if you share with yourself who you are, which is your moral stance, your ethic stance, rather than what you are, which could be anything that you want to declare it, that may make a difference. And so, that's really kind of what I share with people. Every morning, look at yourself in the mirror. And are you going to show everyone today who you are? Or do you want them to see what you are, which could be extremely superficial, political, what have you?
Alejandro?
Yeah, since I'd like to share my experience partly with, since we're talking about the AMA, how important it is that the AMA take up this issue and pronounce themselves and take, not remain silent. The U.S. can't afford to remain a silent bystander with the face of these crimes. I would really, when I speak to my congressman last year about some of the forced organ harvesting legislation that's currently, the bills that you mentioned that are currently in Congress, first thing he asked me was, well, what's the AMA said about this? And I told him that they haven't really made a formal statement other than there was a small statement they wrote last year, but it was very superficial, and it really did not include the China Tribunal. And it didn't go enough to inform the American doctors. Doctors need to know about this information. I can't convey how few physicians in the United States really know about these atrocities. I've talked to people in my hospital, and I've gotten some signatures for some of these bills. And talking to people, so few doctors have heard about it, or they just know about it superficially. And it just goes to show the power of the media, that there's just not been enough coverage. And doctors don't know about it, and the medical societies, they need to be our voice. They need to speak for all the community of medical doctors here in the United States. So we need to see leadership from the AMA. And I would really urge them to do so. It's so encouraging to see that, for example, the British Medical Association and the Canadian Medical Association have pronounced themselves and condemn forced organ harvesting. And as a result, I think that's what's led, for example, in Britain, for the government to pass forced organ harvesting legislation criminalizing transplant tourism. And the Canadian Medical Association is also supporting legislation in Canada. So we really need the support from the AMA. We need the government and the medical community to work together. It's so important for the United States, again, to not remain silent and side with. Silence is, in essence, standing with the oppressors, and we need to be siding on the side of the victims who are being systematically harvested alive. This horrific crime that all of us know. We need to keep working to bring it to an end. Thank you.
Thank you. Martin, do you want to continue?
I've got very little to add, except to say again, thank you for listening. But I think all the work that was done by Matas and colleagues and Jay Levy and all the others who've worked so hard over the years, that plus the pooled evidence presented by the China Tribunal, have given everybody some tools to go and work to persuade all the organizations, and clearly the AMA is an important one, but we have to do everything we can over and over again. And what I've learned from this is that you need immense patience, and small steps can in the end make you win the race, but it's very patient and much slower than you'd like it to be.
True, yes. Weldon?
Yeah, first of all, again, thank you. Thank you to the panel and thank you to the audience. I guess the last thing I'll leave with is a little bit of hope and encouragement. I think one of the real positive things to me, I reached out to Dr. Beta back in 2016, and you can see here we are together on this panel. He's made it a part of his curriculum and teaching bioethics at the University of Arizona, which is my alma mater. And I'll tell you just a brief story. About 2 months ago, I was talking to the residents about hematology, and one of the residents said, "Oh, you spoke to me about a year ago about forced organ harvesting, and I can't stop reading about it and understanding it." So I think my hope is all the work that's been done by the Tribunal, by David Matus and David Kilgore and Ethan Gutman, and our organization, Doctors Against Forced Organ Harvesting. All of this work is there, but the light of awareness is still very dim. I mean, in my experience, less than 10% of the entire medical community actually knows what forced organ harvesting is. And even less than that, actually, just a fraction of that has any kind of understanding of a tribunal or the massive amount of data that's out there. And you see this sort of recapitulated in our media. But my hope is the people that hear about it, you do move people to want to act. And I think we're at a point where we need to give them the tools to act. So thank you.
Thank you, Verden. Jay, if you may.
Yeah, back in 1962, when the Nazi official Adolf Eichmann was tried in Jerusalem for his part of exterminating the Jews during the Holocaust, Hannah Arendt, the American-German philosopher, termed the coin the banality of evil, as expressing what the Nazi were doing. It's chilling to see that the banality of evil, which we thought we won't see never again, is taking place for the past 30 years in China, and even to this day. As far as what we can do, mainly us as physicians, as I said earlier, I think international society should take example from the International Society of Heart and Lung Transplantation, and first and foremost, established an academic boycott on the Chinese Medical Association. It has been very efficient tool in the past. Unfortunately, as I mentioned, it has been lifted because of the declaration of the alleged reform in China, and it's time to put this academic boycott back again as at least the initial step that we as physicians can do before we step forward to our governments and ask them to put their parts in this quest of seizing the use of organs from executed prisoners. Thank you for giving me the chance to participate in this webinar.
Thank you, Jay. This concludes our roundtable discussion today. I would like to thank all of our honored speakers for this inspiring discussion and the audience questions that I hope will help medical professionals to look into their hearts and decide for themselves whether forced organ harvesting of living people can be allowed to continue to destroy the respect and confidence of our patients, of our noble profession. The American Medical Association will be holding its annual meeting in a few days, and perhaps you are now better informed and updated on these crimes and what you and your patients can do against these crimes. Given the atrocity that we face as humankind, there is much more to do to end this crime against humanity. Forced organ harvesting from living prisoners of conscience can by no means or excuse be accepted in today's global community. And every doctor and every individual has to make a decision. Do I want to live in a world where a government can arbitrarily kill innocent people for their organs? Or do I speak up now? I think it is time to break the silence and that national medical associations take the lead to end this atrocity. Thank you all, and goodbye.